Yes, I love that question. Because you are really, and I'm not saying this you know, in a personally critical way, but you are expressing one of the common myths of 1980 college education. But I would recommend one textbook, because I can't fully answer this. I'll do my best. There's one textbook that if you're interested in that, and if let's say you took the position that you're asking me about and you're challenging me, and you want to really refute it, you have to read one textbook called The American Great Depression by Murray Rothbard. Because he turned me around, because I was raised to believe exactly as your question implied, is that capitalism and the gold standard caused the Great Depression. And that Herbert Hoover was a free market person who perpetuated the Depression because he was demanding capitalism and the gold standard and free markets. Nothing could be further from the truth. The full explanation of the business cycle has not occurred until the 20th century by von Mises, who was the 20th century leader of the Austrian school. Of course, he's the one that explains that the business cycle is caused by the Federal Reserve System. Creation of credit, the contraction of credit, the boom and the bust. So you have to look at monetary policy of the 1920s, again under a Republican administration. Rapid monetary expansion, inflation. Don't ever believe for a minute that inflation is price increases. That is one of the consequences of inflation. Inflation is the increase in the supply of money and credit. So we had the inflation of the 20s, that was setting the stage. We had the contraction of the credit by the Federal Reserve in 1929. They precipitated the crash. And then there was deflation. There was deflation because we were still loosely linked to the gold standard. But if you go back and look at what Hoover did, he did everything, maybe not as efficiently as Roosevelt did, but he imposed a lot of government restrictions and restraints, introduced a lot of the programs that Roosevelt just made much bigger. So he was a first of our presidents since George Washington ever to impose government intervention in the economy trying to take care of the Depression. In 1921, for instance, 10 years before, there was a depression, but it lasted 6 to 12 months because the government just kept their hands off. But Hoover did not keep his hands off. The inflation of the money supply was the main culprit. Look at the history of the business cycle since the creation of the Federal Reserve, since 1913. We had the inflation of the war, Depression of 21, the inflation of the 20s, Depression of the 30s, and a business cycle all the way through. Great crash of 1987. It's on and on. But I suggest that you read Murray Rothbard. It's a great book, and I'm convinced he'll convert you as he converted me.
Are you talking about Hoover's policies, like in helping the banks, or what other policies? Government
intervention. He kept wages up, and he had farm programs and different things. He had many, many different programs that he introduced. But the artificial keeping up of wages, where the correction wasn't allowed to occur, so very many of these programs he introduced.
Yes. You said, I was reading your literature here, and you said that space exploration should be open to the public and all. Does that mean you don't want the government to be in it? And what about things like scientific research and stuff? Would there be government grants for that, or would it have to be privately funded?
On yes and no on that, and I'll sort it out. The space program, when it's for only economic development and when it's subsidizing companies that want to put up satellites, no, the government shouldn't be involved in that. But space technology, I think, is a legitimate defense expenditure, knowledge of space, because we live in a space age. It makes a lot more sense to me to bring World War II type foot soldiers home from Japan and put more money into a space defense system. That, to me, seems to be logical. On an R&D, only for the purpose of national defense, R&D ought to come from business people and universities and the people who should be involved. It should never be political. Politicians, believe me, all you have to do is go down to Washington and you'll find out politicians are always political. I mean, they're not wise. They don't have great wisdom of knowing who should get the research funds. So I would say that it'd be much better off. There'd be a lot more funds. That would be the magnificent part about it. The country would be wealthier. The corporations wouldn't be in debt. And they're more likely to fund the universities. So they shouldn't be in it just for the sake of research. But if it's space technology, yes, I would believe that there would be certainly some of that in a libertarian society.
Yes. I agree a lot with what you say about humanitarian policy at home, but I don't see the practical application of a libertarian president in the United States. I think it would be too much of a shock for the entire world to have one of the greatest countries ever to change in such a radical way. And, you know, the American way is such a balance. You say the Constitution is, you know, we should go back to what the Constitution said. Well, they had no idea what they were getting into. They left some room for growth, but they had no idea what would happen. And I just don't see the practical application of a libertarian president.
Okay, but they really didn't leave room to destroy the principle of freedom, you know, the concept of individual rights and the purpose of government. You say it would be a radical change. I think the extremists are in government. How can you say somebody who wants a balanced budget is a radical extremist and wants these radical changes when we get a conservative president that triples the national debt in 6 years and runs up a deficit in 1 year of $220 billion? That to me is extremism and is very dangerous. You say, well, they might not be able to accept these changes from the status quo, which I would grant there would be some changes. But you shouldn't compare that to the problems of accepting these changes. You ought to compare it to what it's like when all the people of this country get a Social Security check and it doesn't buy anything. Look at what happens when you have inflation of 20 or 30 or 40% in a year, or unemployment rates at 25%. That's what you have to compare it to. We have to prevent these great problems coming by offering up sound economic policies. So I think the real calamity is not doing anything. Yes, there's going to be adjustments, but it's sort of like you telling me that the drug addict doesn't want to get off drugs because he gets sick, he gets uncomfortable, and you know he doesn't feel good when he's trying to get off drugs. Certainly he doesn't feel good. And the economy is not going to feel real good when you quit feeding it deficit financing and inflation. But what happens to the drug addict if he doesn't stop? He dies. And that's the kind of a system we have here today. Now, if you say that that's all poppycock, if you say, no, I don't agree with that, we have a healthy economy, and you believe that nonsense of the supply-siders, then you just sit back and forget about it because everything is going to be okay. Instead of this being something threatening, to me, I see this as conciliatory and the only compromise that can work. Let me give you an example. The Democrats and the Republicans are always arguing about the budget deficits, and they always get together because they both endorse government spending, one for big business and military-industrial complex, the other for poor man's welfare. And they get together and they always raise both. I mean, that always happens. It never really gets cut. The libertarian is the only one that has a reasonable chance of going to the conservative and say, you know, I do support you. I think you're on the right track on free enterprise and that welfare is out of control. And I can go to the liberal and say to the liberal, yes, I agree with you. There's too much spending in the Pentagon. So I can bring these people together where the conservative and liberal, all they're going to do is bicker, and they're going to raise it. And I'm also convinced, for what I've stated earlier, that under the system of non-intervention, you're less likely to have war and conflict.
It seems that the libertarian ideology is very caring, but yet how is the Libertarian Party going to take care of the people that cannot provide for their own individual freedoms, like, let's say the old or the mentally retarded or the handicapped? I mean, if you abolish the welfare system, who's going to take care of those people?
Well, the first thing is you'd have a lot less. I mean, if government intervention takes a country that has a 3% need and turns it into a 20% need, so we've immediately eliminated 17%. Your question is there will always be somebody in need. Well, we cannot violate our principles. We cannot violate the Constitution. And we think that if we get involved with the government, we're going to make the problem worse. So we don't even think about that. We think that people are more likely to be taken care of if the country is prosperous and they have jobs. So therefore, it will take a charitable nature. The families have to do it. The communities have to do it. The church has to do it. But you have a much better chance. It isn't going to be utopia. But at least you wouldn't have abject poverty and suffering and business cycle and stock market crashes. I mean, the alternative is so much better, but far from utopia. I mean, I'm not proposing utopia, but what I'm saying is there's going to be a much better chance for you to help take care of that problem because you're likely to have a job in a libertarian free market. So therefore, you can help take care of some people.
Yeah, I was wondering if you'd expand a bit on your comment about
that you don't care if what people choose to smoke. I was wondering, does that mean you're opposed to like national campaigns such as Just Say No that tries to educate the youth against the use of drugs and the problems that arise?
I've been very much involved in drug education in my local community. My wife works a whole lot, and we've raised 5 children that didn't use drugs. And I, as a physician, work very hard to, deal with the drug problem. So my motivations and my efforts have been there. I would always say that is the way. Just Say No programs is great, but I would never use taxpayers' money to do it. What I would do is get what so many have already done. Movie stars and athletes have been participating, and I'm sure I hope they don't get a lot of money for those ads. My assumption would be that they feel strongly about this and they're doing something to try to get people to just say no. I think that's a wonderful system, and that's the way it should be. But this drug culture is a reflection of a societal problem rather than the lack of strong laws. I mean, just look at the drug problem. That is a disaster. All the money that we're spending doesn't do any good whatsoever. Our CIA has been known to be a dealer in drugs and involved with drugs. The drug laws have literally been accused of being the cause of 50% of our crime in this country. The terrorist nation love the drug laws because they can make so much money off the drugs. The drug dealers, what would you do if they didn't have drug laws? The drug dealers would all be out of business. I mean, it is such a disaster. And there's no evidence whatsoever to prove that there's more drug usage because if they were legal. Matter of fact, again, back to 1914, I think it was 1914 of the Harrison Act. Before that, Americans smoked coke and drank coke and did all the stuff. And, I mean, we weren't a nation of heroin addicts, even when there weren't laws against it. So that is a serious social problem. My argument would be, I don't condone any of that, but I would say the solution comes a different way, without coercion. If there's somebody holding their hand in the back, I can't quite see them. Let's try back here.
Can we have countries that are equally and stuff all around the world, and we could have freedom and do what we want to do and stuff?
I can't quite hear that question. If somebody wants to state it for me if they heard it.
Can we have equally countries all around the world and have freedom and do what we want to do?
Well, we could hope that, and I think the best way to have freedom around the world is for us to set a good example. Just like an individual in a community, he can't go into somebody else's house and tell them how they should live, but a leader in a community can set an example so others may follow. So we as a country, whether it has to do with an economic system or a monetary system or the way we act and behave, and that is following the rules of freedom. If we set a good example and show that it's worked, others will follow us. If we as a leader, and we are, if we set the example that we should run our economy poorly and inflate the currency and cause a lot of problems, others follow us too. So the best way to spread freedom around the world would be to set a good example.
Would that mean that you'd want to pull away from being a counterbalancer force against the Soviet Union, like pull away from NATO? Because that's what you were saying, but you were giving, like, Japan as an example of a country that doesn't have a strong defense because it's written in their constitution, but then we strongly help NATO and stuff, and we are the active force against communism in the world. What would you say about that?
I think the best way to develop a stronger anti-communist position is to accept the libertarian position. I think the current position is very, very weak. There's a lot of talk about anti-communism, but quite frankly, if you look at the record, you will find out that funding of the communists did not go down under the Reagan administration. All administrations continue funding to the Soviet bloc nations. And that now that we've signed this treaty with the Soviets, they are going to now get even more funding. The foreign policy that I described earlier, where we disrupt these countries, that literally sets the stage for communism to grow. A libertarian president would certainly clean out the State Department. I mean, I would not have a State Department. Of course, I would have a very small State Department, but I certainly would get rid of the left-leaning members of the State Department who support governments like Mozambique. No, and I don't believe we need to be in NATO. I think that there's very strong evidence, a lot of writing on this today, by many individuals. And there's a book out, it says